Oh my, she got me a little bit worked up with that. That was very sweet. I'm really not that nice, but anyway. Well, I hope this weekend has been an encouragement to you guys. And I know it's been a lot to take in, and you've been given a lot to think about. I hope it's been encouraging and helpful, and we have something to take home and ponder and to let the Lord work in our hearts and work out into our lives. So we have quite a bit to cover, so we can get started. I'm going to read Hebrews 11:32 through 12:3. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended in their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Let's pray. Father, we are beyond privileged to have access to you through Jesus Christ our Savior. Thank you for all you accomplished through the faithfulness and endurance of Christ. Help us now to understand your word and use it to make us more like Jesus. Lord, I ask your words would be spoken through me, that you give me clarity of thought, and I thank you for the opportunity to share your word. Amen. So, we've just gone through this beautiful list, exposition of all these examples that we find in the Old Testament of faithful followers of God. And we get to verse 32, and our author says, "And what more can I say? So much has been said, and he has so much more that could be said." The examples are just too much for him to even begin to tell. He says, "Time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets." And I have to say, time would fail me too. So we're not going to look at every single one of those. We just have such a huge amount of examples to look at between verse 32 and going on through 38 or so. So we're just going to kind of hit on a few of them and then move on. So he has so many examples of faith. There are so many he could name, but he doesn't have time to elaborate, so he just bursts out with this final list. We see people who are commended through their faith and strength, as well as in weakness and suffering. In verses 32 through, if we just want to look at 32, we could just look at Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and David and Samuel. I sent in your emails, you had a few passages to read out of Judges, and some of those hit on Gideon, I believe we did Gideon, Barak, and Samson. And what you see in these people who were commended because of their exploits and their strength and their victories, we also saw kind of weakness and failure and some kind of weird stories. So even though we can't look at all of them, I'd like to talk a little bit about, we'll start with Gideon. So when we find Gideon in Judges, he is actually so fearful, so scared of the Midianites who have been coming in, and I think Pastor Doug just talked about this recently, actually. They had been coming in and raiding the country of the food. So Israel was being oppressed severely by the Midianites. But we find Gideon hiding in a wine press, beating out the wheat because he was hiding. He didn't want the Midianites to come and get it. So we have him there, and the angel of the Lord appears to him and gives him instruction. And he's to go and fight the Midianites. And he's told he will be victorious. But he's not sure. And so if you remember the story of Gideon, he questions the Lord. He asks for some signs through if you remember, the fleece. But he does act on faith, and he goes. He just struggles. He's hesitant at first. Barak is a little bit the same way. He was approached by Deborah, the prophetess and judge, and was told to go and defeat Sisera's army. She said, she was speaking for the Lord, and she said, God says, I will be with you. You will be victorious. Well, he, again, said he would go, but he would only go if Deborah went with him. And so you see some fearfulness there in his hesitancy to just hear the word of the Lord. Gideon knew the angel of the Lord had spoken to him and said, oh, Mr. Angel of the Lord, you're going to have to convince me of the veracity of what you're telling me. So Gideon required the fleece or two as a sign to reassure him before he would believe God. And Barak wouldn't go unless Deborah the judge went with him, the prophetess and judge. We looked at Samson, and he has a huge long story in Judges, and he was no paragon of virtue either. He broke his Nazirite vow. He led a very rebellious and sensual life, and eventually his rebellion resulted in his death, but at the end, we see his faith, and we see his faith throughout his story too. He did do what he was told when he went against the Philistines, but at the end, he actually had been so humbled and eventually had to call out to the Lord, and he was strengthened and brought down the temple columns. Remember, he pushed on those and took out all the Philistines. So we have these people, and we have David on here too, and we are familiar with his story that he is known for his adultery, and he's known for being a murderer. Well, he was also a man after God's own heart, so he was a man of faith too. I just think it's so interesting to have this mixture, and we've seen this all the way through in all of the scripture we've looked at this week. And I was thinking, if I was making this list, I probably would have picked the people like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be kind of in that top tier of people to be listed instead of these that just seem to struggle in their faith a little bit. We didn't see Daniel hesitating whenever he stood up to the king's edict and went ahead and prayed and obeyed the Lord rather than obey the king and the edict that he had put out. We see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they didn't bow to the idol that King Nebuchadnezzar had built. And so both Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced certain death to be thrown into the lion's den or to be thrown into the fiery furnace, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were. They obviously, through their faith, stood up to the kings and trusted the Lord with whatever he was going to do, and they survived. So those are the kinds of people that I kind of look at and I think, I want a faith like that, and those are the people that I would want to recognize. But God gave us examples of people who dealt with sin and weakness. In his commentary on Hebrews, Tom Schreiner says, "It's not the sins and faults of these men that are remembered, but their faith and trust in God, showing that perseverance in faith is not the same thing as perfection. Indeed, one may sin dramatically and still persevere in faith. So God doesn't discount faith even when his people fail miserably. And perhaps having these imperfect men presented here was an encouragement to the Hebrew Christians as they struggled with their faith. I know I can be encouraged by knowing that, because I know I have struggles in my faith too." So in verses 35 and through 38, we see those who suffered terrible torture, beatings, imprisonment, ghastly deaths, and extreme poverty. It says women, the 35, women received back their dead by resurrection, kind of goes with this. It's like 35a. 35b says some were tortured. We know, and refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, sawn in two, killed with the sword, and they had extreme poverty and were destitute. We know that there are prophets that fit into this particular little list. We know that Zechariah was stoned, Jeremiah by tradition says he was stoned. Isaiah was sawn in two. Several were beaten, and so we have these people who were utterly despised by the world. But God says the world was actually not worthy of them when we get to 38, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. So their value by God was not defined by their standing in this world. Those who were considered weak and worthless were precious to God, and their suffering did not go unnoticed by him. They had a forward-looking faith, and they were willing to endure for the better life that was promised. Again, Mr. Schreiner says, faith trusts in triumphs and tragedies, in the highs and lows of life. Faith gives itself entirely to God. If he ordains victory through faith, as he did through many of the judges and David, faith rejoices in the goodness God gives. If there is torture, death, and suffering, faith holds on to God, knowing that a better resurrection is coming and the pain and torment of the present world will not last. And so we have the Old Testament believers who were looking forward to that better resurrection and were able to endure and press on in the midst of all these terrible circumstances. In verse 39, we see that it says, all of these, though commended in their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. In this verse, we see that the believers were commended, but didn't receive what was promised. They believed in what was promised, but didn't receive the ultimate fulfillment of that promise. Why? Because the something better, the reality, had not yet come. Hebrews 10:1 says, "For since the law, the old covenant, has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near." In the coming of Jesus, God has provided something better for all who believe. In his incarnation, which was God being made like us in human form, in his death and his resurrection, Jesus is, according to Hebrews 9:15, the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. The Old Testament believers' faith pointed to Jesus, and they were declared righteous through that faith. The old covenant with the laws and sacrifices could not perfect them. It was just a shadow and copy of the reality. The Christ that the Hebrew Christians and we have faith in, who died on the cross and was raised from the dead for our justification, is the better. He's the better one. He's the promised one that the Old Testament believers looked forward to. So the Old Testament believers, if you look in verse 40, apart from us, they should not be made perfect. The Old Testament believers were not perfected apart from us. Our salvation and theirs came through Jesus, and we all wait for the day when Christ returns and will be made like him in final perfect glorification. And I think when I was studying this, that was one of the main things that hit me was knowing I'm part of this whole family of believers, going back all the way to the Old Testament to see Abraham and Moses. They were looking to the same thing that I looked to, that saved me. It saved them too. I love the idea that we're just all part. And I think it's going to be so cool when we're all together in heaven together and we get to talk to them and we get to be brothers and sisters. I just think it's so cool. And I think of the promised glorification and that he foreknew them. It made me think of Romans 8. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And those whom he foreknew, he called, and those whom he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. That applied to those Old Testament believers. The Hebrew Christians needed to know that they could look to that example and look and be encouraged by the faith that helped the Old Testament believers endure, and know that that same faith was going to have an effect in their life if they would, as they persevered in their struggles that they were having. So we are going to go on to chapter 12, and look at verses 1 through 3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. The author transitions to this section with a big therefore, which we already know points back. We find out what it's there for by looking back to what has come before. So it's pointing us back to the chapter we just left. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, as the context refers back to the faithful ones we met in chapter 11, they then are the witnesses that surround us as we run this race, as the Hebrew Christians ran their race that was set before them, and whose lives testify to the truth of the promises of God. There is an idea that the witnesses are... I've heard people say that it's, our grandmas and grandpas and people watching us and keeping track of us. And I tend to believe it because of the context that it's referring to this cloud of witnesses that we've just had presented to us. And so they're not so much looking at us as we're looking to them and to the example that they've set. These witnesses have run this race and they've endured to the end. The Greek word for witness here has the meaning of someone who has an experiential knowledge of something. So we find encouragement and exhortation in a call to endure here. And the author employs a great metaphor to encourage the Hebrew believers to continue in their faith, running a race. This race has been set before them. And I like that idea too, that it's not just something that has just happened. It's been set before us. We go where the road that has been set before us goes. We trust that God's in control of everything that happens in the race we're running. But anyway, can you guys tell, I keep adding these ideas and it's getting me all, making me bounce around. So these believers, the Hebrew Christians, the Jewish Hebrew Christians, would have no problem understanding this point that was being made because of being exposed to the different races and athletic events that they had in that time. So we can relate to this example too, because we've at least all watched a race. I mean, we just came out of the Olympics this past summer, and I'm sure we saw lots of races there. But even if we've never actually participated in a race, we understand what it entails. My one and only official race claim to fame occurred in elementary school when I was in our school district's Little Olympics. And Lance would totally roll his eyes at this story. He's not impressed, but I'm impressed because it's my claim to fame. But this was a pretty big deal because I got to run the anchor leg of my relay race, and I won. I crossed the finish line first. And my principal said I ran like a deer, and I kind of basked in the glow of that praise for a while. So when I got to middle school, I thought I'd take my running prowess and give the track team a go. Unfortunately, my get up and go got up and went when I hit my first practice. I found I prefer little relays over the long distance stuff. They were crazy. It was too much running. So that was it for me for track. But the race described here is not one that believers can just give up on and walk away from. It's not a sprint that we can just finish up quickly so we can go about and do the real business of life. We can't say too much running, although we may certainly feel that way at times. We're in this race until the end of our lives, and it's a marathon that requires discipline, perseverance, and effort. And and here we've been directed to the people who have already, examples that these people have who have already been there and done that in our Old Testament characters, who have run the race, who have finished the race. So the faith and faithful actions of those who have gone before encourage and inspire us to run and to endure as they bear witness to the faithfulness of God. They are cheering us on, as it were, by their example. F.F. Bruce says again, it's not so much that they're looking at us as we're looking to them for their example. Running a marathon takes endurance, and the writer instructs us now in how to endure. We must lay aside every weight. Let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Runners don't run well when they're weighed down. You don't normally see a runner hitting the track wearing boots and a heavy coat. To run effectively, excess weight and baggage must be laid down. Now, this weight and baggage may not necessarily be a bad thing in and of itself here. I think of the example of possessions. Something that one person possesses may be no problem for them. Another person may have the same thing, and it turns into an idol in their life. That would be a weight that they would need to put aside so that they could run effectively. So I think you have to be careful not to overanalyze, but I think it's okay to go to the Lord and say, can you show me in my life where where I'm running with some baggage? Can you show me? And he's faithful, and he will. That's what he does. He's on our side to help us run effectively. So we have to pay attention. See, I did it again. I went off my stuff, and then I got to find. But we must pay attention to be aware of anything that is slowing us down. Ephesians 5:15 says to look carefully then how you walk or run, in our case, not as unwise, but as wise. We also have to deal with the sin that clings so closely or that so easily entangles us. And that will be a struggle until we're out of this fleshly body. There won't be a time when we're here on earth that we're not going to have to pay attention to the sin that clings and entangles us and wants to trip us up. Sinless perfection will come only when Christ returns and we are glorified when we're made like him. Until then, we do battle with sin. Ephesians has a lot to say on this subject. For example, in 4:22, we are told to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and be renewed in the spirit of your minds. Romans 12:2 says, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. The Jewish believers were struggling with the temptation to be conformed to the cultural pressures that were weighing on them, and they were tempted to give in because of the persecution they were experiencing. The writer of Hebrews exhorts them to not look to the world for relief from those struggles, to not go backwards, but to look to the ultimate example of faith, who is Jesus. Several years ago, Lance wanted us all to get bikes, specifically mountain bikes, so we could go on trails together. We didn't go on real trails, like in the wood type trails with the boys, but Lance asked me to go with them once to an in the wood trail, so I did. It was pretty fun until I got to a part of the trail that went downhill a bit and then had a pretty tight right turn. There was a tree right at the spot where you had to make the turn, and I couldn't take my eyes off that tree. I didn't want to hit it, but I found out that you go where you're looking. I had no idea. It was the weirdest thing. I was going down that hill, and I was thinking, I gotta turn, and my body wouldn't do it. I was looking right at that tree, so I went right into that tree. And it hurt. And I got to go and have people feel sorry for me because I had a boo-boo. So I needed to turn, but I couldn't make my body do what I wanted it to do while I was looking at that tree. I headed in the direction of what my eyes were focused on. As we run this race and lay aside the burdens we have, the baggage, the sin, we have to keep our eyes focused on Jesus. He is the source of our faith. We see he's the founder and perfecter of our faith, the founder, the source, the initiator, the completer. He's the one who went before us and established the foundation of our faith. He is the perfecter and completer of our faith. Philippians 1:6, I like this idea. I like the idea of him being the one who works in me to sanctify me and perfect me in my walk with him. Philippians 1:6 says, and I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ. Who's bringing it to completion? The one who started it. He began the good work in you. He will complete it. I'm serious, guys. Think about that. Does that just encourage you? You know, and on days when you just want to give up and move on and think, I'm just done with this stuff, doesn't encourage you to know that Jesus is working in us to complete and bring our faith to completion. In Jude 24, it says, "Now to him who is able to keep you from falling or stumbling, and to present you blameless before the presence of his glory with great joy." I love that too. It's one of my favorites. I just kind of went through and found all my favorite verses, so they just worked in so well with this. He's the one who's able to keep us from falling. He presents us blameless before the presence of his glory with great joy. In 1 Thessalonians 5:23 and 24, it says, "Now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus. He who calls you is faithful, and he will surely do it." I just love that. I think it's so good. How encouraging to know that as we keep our eyes on Jesus, we can know that he's going to help us run our race to the end. We're going to persevere, and we're going to make it to the goal. Even when we feel like we're more slogging through life rather than running, we can know he is at work. He keeps us and prepares us and grows us in our faith, and he helps us to endure. This was the message that the Hebrew Christians needed to hear. We also know that Jesus endured. Verse 2 says, he endured the cross. He despised the shame. And he's seated at the right hand of God. He looked to the joy set before him. F.F. Bruce says, his exaltation to the right hand of God and all that it means for his people's well-being and for the triumph of God's purpose in the universe is the joy set before him, for the sake of which he submitted to shame and death. So all that he accomplished for his people, what he knew he was going to accomplish for eternity, was the joy set before him. And he was willing to submit to ultimate shame and a horrific death on behalf of those he was saving. Jesus' endurance is the ultimate example of endurance. His suffering was the ultimate example of suffering, the greatest in all history. But he endured it for the sake of believers, those who would be purchased through his salvation. The world we live in now is difficult. And I don't know about you, but I feel pressed on a lot just from seeing headlines sometimes, just kind of scrolling through. It just bums me out. It's hard. But like the Hebrew Christians who were and we are not in our society to the point, obviously, that the Hebrew Christians were. But we need encouragement just like they did. And the instruction was to consider Jesus. Consider the one who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Let's be encouraged. Let's not grow weary and be faint-hearted. Let's be encouraged and endure, even if the world turns against us, even as we experience trials and suffering. Because we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So we can have confidence to draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Our faith encompasses a persevering, present persuasion about the promised one that results in a fixed and functioning forward focus. And I would say a fruitful, that goes with functioning. Our lives will reflect the faith that we have. We'll bear that fruit. Yeah, that was the end of my thing. We can be I'm going off my thing, so I'm kind of trying to come up with my last. The Lord was so kind to the Hebrew Christians to show them that life isn't always easy. They had struggles, and he saw them and he cared about them. We can know the same thing, that life isn't always easy, but by faith, by looking to Jesus, by enduring in the race that's set before us, that's how we can finish well. And we can rejoice when we get to be with all these wonderful examples of faith when we are in eternity with them. So let's pray. Father, thank you for your goodness and your faithfulness to us. We love you, and we're thankful that your faithfulness can be seen all around us. Lord, help us to walk in a manner that's worthy of you. Help us as we go to take in the message of the love that you had, that you would endure such punishment and wrath, Lord Jesus, on our behalf. Thank you that you were willing to do that. Father, thank you for providing your Son for us so that we can have life. Lord, I pray for each one of us as we go. I pray that your love would just be so real, and your presence would be so real to us as we go out. Thank you for all you've provided. Thank you for everything that's been done this weekend. And we pray that it has glorified you, Lord. We love you in Jesus' name.